Section 33 of A Popular History of France, vol. v. This is in the public domain. A Popular History of France from the Earliest Times, vol. v. By Francois Guizot. Translated by Robert Black. CHAPTER XLI. Louis XIII., Cardinal Richelieu, and Foreign Affairs. This was Cardinal Richelieu's distinction, that all his contemporaries, in the same way as Voiture, identified the mishaps and the successes of their country with his own fortunes, and that upon him alone were fixed the eyes of Europe, whether friendly or hostile, when it supported or when it fought against France. For 4 years the war was carried on with desperation by land and sea in the Low Countries, in Germany, and in Italy, with alternations of success and reverse. The actors disappeared one after another from the scene. The Emperor, Ferdinand II., had died on the 15th of February, 1637; the election of his son, Ferdinand III., had not been recognized by France and Sweden; Bernard of Saxe Weimar succumbed, at 34 years of age, on the 15th of July, 1639, after having beaten in the preceding year the celebrated John van Weert, whom he sent a prisoner to Paris. At his death, the landgravate of Alsace reverted to France, together with the town of Brisach, which he had won from the Imperialists. The Duke of Savoy had died in 1637. His widow, Christine of France, daughter of Henry IV., was, so far as her brother's cause in Italy was concerned, but a poor support. But Count d'Harcourt having succeeded, as head of the army, Cardinal Valette, who died in 1638, had retaken Turin and Casale from the Imperialists in the campaign of 1640. 2 years later, in the month of June, 1642, the Princes Thomas and Maurice, brothers in law of the Duchess Christine, wearied out by the maladresse and haughtiness of the Spaniards, attached themselves definitively to the interests of France, drove out the Spanish garrisons from Nice and Evria, in concert with the Duke of Longueville, and retook the fortress of Tortona as well as all Milaness to the south of the Po. Perpignan, besieged for more than 2 years past by the king's armies, capitulated at the same moment. Spain, hard pressed at home by the insurrection of the Catalans and the revolt of Portugal at the same time, both supported by Richelieu, saw Arras fall into the hands of France, on August 9th, 1640; and the plot contrived with the Duke of Bouillon and the Count of Soissons fail at the battle of La Marfee, where this latter prince was killed on the 16th of July, 1641. In Germany, Marshal Guebriant and the Swedish general Torstenson, so paralyzed that he had himself carried in a litter to the head of his army, had just won back from the empire Silesia, Moravia, and nearly all Saxony. The chances of war were everywhere favorable to France, a just recompense for the indomitable perseverance of Cardinal Richelieu through good and evil fortune. "The great tree of the house of Austria was shaken to its very roots, and he had all but felled that trunk which with its 2 branches covers the north and the west, and throws a shadow over the rest of the earth." Lettres de Malherbe. The king, for a moment shaken in his fidelity towards his minister by the intrigues of Cinq Mars, had returned to the cardinal with all the impetus of the indignation caused by the guilty treaty made by his favorite with Spain. All Europe thought as the young captain in the guards, afterwards Marshal Fabert, who, when the king said to him, "I know that my army is divided into 2 factions, Royalists and Cardinalists; which are you for?" answered, "Cardinalists, sir, for the cardinal's party is yours." The cardinal and France were triumphing together; but the conqueror was dying. Cardinal Richelieu had just been removed from Ruel to Paris. For several months past, the cardinal's health, always precarious, had taken a serious turn. It was from his sick bed that he, a prey to cruel agonies, directed the movements of the army, and, at the same time, the prosecution of Cinq Mars. All at once his chest was attacked, and the cardinal felt that he was dying. On the 2d of December, 1642, public prayers were ordered in all the churches. The king went from St. Germain to see his minister. The cardinal was quite prepared. "I have this satisfaction," he said, "that I have never deserted the king, and that I leave his kingdom exalted and all his enemies abased." He commended his relatives to his Majesty, "who, on their behalf, will remember my services." Then, naming the 2 secretaries of state, Chavigny and de Noyers, he added, "Your Majesty has Cardinal Mazarin; I believe him to be capable of serving the king." And he handed to Louis XIII. a proclamation which he had just prepared for the purpose of excluding the Duke of Orleans from any right to the regency in case of the king's death. The preamble called to mind that the king had 5 times already pardoned his brother, recently engaged in a new plot against him. The king had left the cardinal, but without returning to St. Germain. He remained at the Louvre. Richelieu had in vain questioned the physicians as to how long he had to live. One only dared to go beyond commonplace hopes. "Monseigneur," he said, "in 24 hours you will be dead or cured." "That is the way to speak," said the cardinal, and he sent for the priest of St. Eustache, his parish. As they were bringing into his chamber the Holy Eucharist, he stretched out his hand, and, "There," said he, "is my judge before whom I shall soon appear. I pray him with all my heart to condemn me if I have ever had any other aim than the welfare of religion and of the state." The priest would have omitted certain customary questions, but, "Treat me as the commonest of Christians," said the cardinal; and when he was asked to pardon his enemies, "I never had any but those of the state," answered the dying man. The cardinal's family surrounded his bed, and the attendance was numerous. The Bishop of Lisieux, Cospdan, a man of small wits but of sincere devoutness, listened attentively to the firm speech, the calm declarations of the expiring minister. "So much self confidence appals me," he said below his breath. "Richelieu died as he had lived, without scruples and without delicacies of conscience, absorbed by his great aim, and but little concerned about the means he had employed to arrive at it. I believe absolutely all the truths taught by the church," he had said to his confessor, and this faith sufficed for his repose. The memory of the scaffolds he had caused to be erected did not so much as recur to his mind. "I have loved justice, and not vengeance; I have been severe towards some, in order to be kind towards all," he had said in his will, written in Latin. He thought just the same on his death bed. The king left him, not without emotion and regret. The cardinal begged Madame d'Aiguillon, his niece, to withdraw. "She is the one whom I have loved most," he said. Those around him were convulsed with weeping. A Carmelite whom he had sent for turned to those present, and, "Let those," he said, "who cannot refrain from showing the excess of their weeping and their lamentation, leave the room. Let us pray for this soul." In presence of the majesty of death and eternity, human grandeur disappears irrevocably. The all powerful minister was at that moment only this soul. A last gasp announced his departure. Cardinal Richelieu was dead. He was dead, but his work survived him. On the very evening of the 3d of December, Louis XIII. Called to his council Cardinal Mazarin; and next day he wrote to the Parliaments and governors of provinces, "God having been pleased to take to himself the Cardinal de Richelieu, I have resolved to preserve and keep up all establishments ordained during his ministry; to follow out all projects arranged with him for affairs abroad and at home, in such sort that there shall not be any change. I have continued in my councils the same persons as served me then, and I have called thereto Cardinal Mazarin, of whose capacity and devotion to my service I have had proof, and of whom I feel no less sure than if he had been born amongst my subjects." Scarcely had the most powerful kings yielded up their last breath, when their wishes had been at once forgotten. Cardinal Richelieu still governed in his grave. The king had distributed amongst his ministers' relatives the offices and dignities which he had left vacant. The fortune that came to them was enormous. The legacies left to mere domestics amounted to more than 300,000 livres. During his lifetime Richelieu had given to the crown "my grand hotel, which I built and called Palais de Cardinal, my chapel (chapel service) of gold, enriched with diamonds, my grand buffet of chased silver, and a large diamond that I bought of Lopez." In his will he adds, "I most humbly beseech his Majesty to think proper to have placed in his hands, out of the coined gold and silver that I have at my decease, the sum of 1,500,000 livres, of which sum I can truly say that I made very good use for the great affairs of his kingdom, in such sort that if I had not had this money at my disposal, certain matters which have turned out well would have, to all appearances, turned out ill; which gives me ground for daring to beseech his Majesty to destine this sum, that I leave to him, to be employed on divers occasions which cannot abide the tardiness of financial forms." The minister and priest who had destroyed the power of the grandees in France had, nevertheless, the true instinct respecting the perpetuation of families. "Inasmuch as it hath pleased God," he says in his will, "to bless my labors and make them considered by the king, my kind master, showing recognition of them by his royal munificence, beyond what I could hope for, I have esteemed it a duty to bind my heirs to preserve the estate in my family, in such sort that it may maintain itself for a long while in the dignity and splendor which it hath pleased the king to confer upon it, in order that posterity may know that, as I served him faithfully, he, by virtue of a complete kingliness, knew what love to show me; as I served him faithfully, he, by virtue of a complete kingliness, knew what love to show me, and how to load me with his benefits." The cardinal had taken pleasure in embellishing the estate of Richelieu in Touraine, where he was born, and which the king had raised to a duchy peerage. Mademoiselle de Montpensier, in her Memoires, gives an account of a visit she paid to it in her youth. "I passed," she says, "along a very fine street of the town, all the houses of which are in the best style of building, one like another, and quite newly made, which is not to be wondered at. MM. de Richelieu, though gentlemen of good standing, had never built a town; they had been content with their village, and with a mediocre house. At the present time it is the most beautiful and most magnificent castle you could possibly see, and all the ornament that could be given to a house is found there. This will not be difficult to believe if one considers that it is the work of the most ambitious and most ostentatious man in the world, premier minister of state, too, who for a long while possessed absolute authority over affairs. It is, nevertheless, inconceivable that the apartments should correspond so ill in size with the beauty of the outside. I hear that this arose from the fact that the cardinal wished to have the chamber preserved in which he was born. To adjust the house of a simple gentleman to the grand ideas of the most powerful favorite there has ever been in France, you will observe that the architect must have been hampered. Accordingly, he did not see his way to planning any but very small quarters, which, by way of recompense, as regards gilding or painting, lack no embellishment inside. Amidst all that modern invention has employed to embellish it, there are to be seen, on the chimney piece in a drawing room, the arms of Cardinal Richelieu, just as they were during the lifetime of his father, which the cardinal desired to leave there, because they comprise a collar of the Holy Ghost, in order to prove to those who are wont to misrepresent the origin of favorites that he was born a gentleman of a good house. In this point he imposed upon nobody." The castle of Richelieu is well nigh destroyed; his family, after falling into poverty, is extinct; the Palais Cardinal has assumed the name of Palais Royal; and pure monarchy, the aim of all his efforts and the work of his whole life, has been swept away by the blast of revolution. Of the cardinal there remains nothing but the great memory of his power and of the services he rendered his country. Evil has been spoken, with good reason, of glory. It lasts, however, more durably than material successes, even when they rest on the best security. Richelieu had no conception of that noblest ambition on which a human soul can feed, that of governing a free country, but he was one of the greatest, the most effective, and the boldest as well as the most prudent servants that France ever had. Cardinal Richelieu gave his age, whether admirers or adversaries, the idea which Malherbe expressed in a letter to one of his friends: "You know that my humor is neither to flatter nor to lie; but I swear to you that there is in this man a something which surpasses humanity, and that if our bark is ever to outride the tempests, it will be whilst this glorious hand holds the rudder. Other pilots diminish my fear; this one makes me unconscious of it. Hitherto, when we had to build anew or repair some ruin, plaster alone was put in requisition. Now we see nothing but marble used, and, whilst the counsels are judicious and faithful, the execution is diligent and magnanimous. Wits, judgment, and courage never existed in any man to the degree that they do in him. As for interest, he knows none but that of the public. To that he clings with a passion so unbridled, if I may dare so to speak, that the visible injury it does his constitution is not capable of detaching him from it. Sees he anything useful to the king's service, he goes at it without looking to one side or the other. Obstacles tempt him, resistance piques him, and nothing that is put in his way diverts him. The disregard he shows of self, and of all that touches himself, as if he knew no sort of health or disease but the health or disease of the state, causes all good men to fear that his life will not be long enough for him to see the fruit of what he plants; and, moreover, it is quite evident that what he leaves undone can never be completed by any man that holds his place. Why, man, he does a thing because it has to be done. The space between the Rhine and the Pyrenees seems to him not field enough for the lilies of France. He would have them occupy the two shores of the Mediterranean, and waft their odors thence to the extremest countries of the Orient. Measure by the extent of his designs the extent of his courage." Letters to Racan and to M. de Menthon, OEuvres de Malherbe. The cardinal had been barely 4 months reposing in that chapel of the Sorbonne which he had himself repaired for the purpose, and already King Louis XIII. Was sinking into the tomb. The minister had died at 57, the king was not yet 42, but his always languishing health seemed unable to bear the burden of affairs which had been but lately borne by Richelieu alone. The king had permitted his brother to appear again at court. "Monsieur supped with me," says Mdlle. de Montpensier, "and we had the 24 violins. He was as gay as if MM. Cinq Mars and de Thou had not tarried by the way. I confess that I could not see him without thinking of them, and that in my joy I felt that his gave me a pang." The prisoners and exiles, by degrees, received their pardon. The Duke of Vendome, Bassompierre, and Marshal Vitry had been empowered to return to their castles; the Duchess of Chevreuse and the ex keeper of the seals, Chateauneuf, were alone excepted from this favor. "After the peace," said the declaration touching the regency, which the king got enregistered by the Parliament on the 23d of April. The little dauphin, who had merely been sprinkled, had just received baptism in the chapel of the castle of St. Germain. The king asked him, next day, if he knew what his name was. "My name is Louis XIV.," answered the child. "Not yet, my son, not yet," said the king softly. Louis XIII. Did not cling to life; it had been sad and burdensome to him by the mere fact of his own melancholy and singular character, not that God had denied him prosperity or success. He had the windows opened of his chamber in the new castle of St. Germain looking towards the abbey of St. Denis, where he had at last just laid the body of the queen his mother, hitherto resting at Cologne. "Let me see my last resting place," he said to his servants. The crowd of courtiers thronged to the old castle, inhabited by the queen. Visits were made to the new castle to see the king, who still worked with his ministers. When he was alone, "he was seen nearly always with his eyes open towards heaven, as if he talked with God heart to heart." [Memoires sur la mort de Louis XIII, by his valet de chambre Dubois, Archives curieuses, p. 428.] On the 23d of April, it was believed that the last moment had arrived. The king received extreme unction; a dispute arose about the government of Brittany, given to the king by the Duke of La Meilleraye and claimed by the Duke of Vendome. The two claimants summoned their friends; the queen took fright, and, being obliged to repair to the king, committed the imprudence of confiding her children to the Duke of Beaufort, Vendome's eldest son, a young scatterbrain who made a great noise about this favor. The king rallied and appeared to regain strength. He was sometimes irritated at sight of the courtiers who filled his chamber. "Those gentry," he said to his most confidential servants, "come to see how soon I shall die; if I recover, I will make them pay dearly for their desire to have me die." The austere nature of Louis XIII. Was awakened again with the transitory return of his powers; the severities of his reign were his own as much as Cardinal Richelieu's. He was, nevertheless, dying, asking God for deliverance. It was Thursday, May 14. "Friday has always been my lucky day," said Louis XIII.; "on that day I have undertaken assaults that I have carried; I have even gained battles. I should have liked to die on a Friday." His doctors told him that they could find no more pulse. He raised his eyes to heaven and said out loud, "My God, receive me to mercy," and, addressing himself to all, he added, "Let us pray." Then, fixing his eyes upon the Bishop of Meaux, he said, "You will, of course, see when the time comes for reading the agony prayers; I have marked them all." Everybody was praying and weeping; the queen and all the court were kneeling in the king's chamber. At 3 o'clock he softly breathed his last, on the same day and almost at the same moment at which his father had died beneath the dagger of Ravaillac, 33 years before. France owed to Louis XIII. 18 years of Cardinal Richelieu's government; and that is a service which she can never forget. "The minister made his sovereign play the second part in the monarchy, and the first in Europe," said Montesquieu; "he abased the king, but he exalted the reign." It is to the honor of Louis XIII. That he understood and accepted the position designed for him by Providence in the government of his kingdom, and that he upheld with dogged fidelity a power which often galled him all the while that it was serving him. End of the Project Gutenberg EBook of Chapter 41.